What would you do if the last $5 bill to your name was the only thing standing between you and starvation, but a shivering stranger begged you for it? Arthur gave it away. 24 hours later, that same shivering stranger bought his company, and she remembered his face. The rain in Seattle didn't just fall, it oppressed. It was a cold, driving sheet of grey that soaked through worn fabric and settled deep into the bones. Arthur Pendleton stood under the flickering fluorescent light of the 4th Avenue bus shelter, his collar turned up against the biting wind. He shoved his hands deeper into the pockets of his threadbare trench coat, his fingers brushing against a small, crumpled piece of paper. It was a $5 bill. It was also, quite literally, his entire net worth. Arthur pulled his phone from his pocket, shielding the cracked screen from the rain. He opened his banking app out of a masochistic habit. Available balance, 42 cents. He closed his eyes, the heavy exhaustion of single fatherhood and relentless poverty pressing down on his shoulders. Tomorrow was Thursday. Payday wasn't until Friday at midnight. That $5 bill had to cover a loaf of cheap bread, a jar of generic peanut butter, and his bus fare to get to work the next morning. His 7-year-old daughter, Lily, was safely asleep at Mrs. Higgins's apartment down the hall from theirs, but the elderly neighbor's patience for late payments was wearing thin. Arthur's wife, Sarah, had passed away 3 years ago from a sudden, aggressive lymphoma. She had left behind a void that could never be filled, and a mountain of medical debt that had systematically stripped Arthur of his savings, his car, and his modest suburban home. Now he worked as a mid-level data processor at a logistics firm, a job that barely kept the lights on and the eviction notices at bay. A sudden, violent shivering pulled Arthur from his thoughts. He looked to his left. A woman had just stumbled under the glass canopy of the bus shelter. Arthur blinked, momentarily taken aback. Even in the dim, flickering light, she looked entirely out of place, yet entirely broken. She was wearing what appeared to be the ruined remains of a tailored charcoal suit, now plastered to her skin by the freezing rain. She had no coat, no purse, and no shoes, only torn stockings on bleeding feet. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, and her lips were a dangerous, translucent shade of blue. Several other people were huddled under the shelter, but in true city fashion, they all collectively decided she was invisible. A teenager put his headphones on. A businessman in a dry overcoat turned his back, engrossed in his phone. Arthur watched as the woman leaned against the glass, her knees buckling slightly. She looked around, panic wide and raw in her eyes. She approached the businessman first. "Please," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper over the traffic. "I've been mugged. They took my phone, my wallet, my car. I just need bus fare to get to the downtown precinct. Please." The businessman didn't even look up. "I don't carry cash," he muttered, stepping further away. She turned to a middle-aged woman holding an umbrella. "Ma'am, please, I'm freezing." "There's a shelter 3 blocks down," the woman said coldly, avoiding eye contact. The desperate woman's shoulders slumped. She wrapped her arms around herself, violently trembling, tears mingling with the rain on her cheeks. She looked utterly defeated, ready to collapse onto the filthy concrete. Arthur felt a tight knot form in his chest. He knew the arithmetic of his survival. He knew that giving up that $5 meant he wouldn't eat tomorrow. It meant he would have to walk 4 miles to work in the rain. It meant risking his job if he was late. A job that was already hanging by a thread due to the impending corporate buyout his company was facing. But as he looked at her, he didn't see a stranger. He saw a human being pushed to the absolute brink. He remembered the night Sarah died, standing in the hospital parking lot, screaming into the void, feeling entirely alone in a world that didn't care. Arthur took a deep breath, pulled his hand from his pocket, and stepped forward. "Excuse me," Arthur said, his voice gentle but firm. The woman flinched, turning to him with wide, fearful eyes. Up close, Arthur could see a dark bruise forming on her cheekbone, a testament to the violence she had just endured. "Here," Arthur said, holding out the crumpled $5 bill. "The 41 bus comes in 2 minutes. It goes straight past the central precinct. This will cover your fare, and you'll have a few bucks left over to get a hot coffee from the vending machine in the lobby." The woman stared at the bill as if he were holding out a winning lottery ticket. She looked from the money to Arthur's face, studying the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, his worn coat, his taped-up shoes. She possessed a sharp, calculating intelligence in her gaze that pierced right through her current misery. I can't take this," she stammered, her teeth chattering. "I can tell you need it." "I need a lot of things." Arthur smiled faintly, a sad, self-deprecating curve of his lips. "But right now, you need to not freeze to death. Take it." He pressed the bill into her trembling hand. Her fingers were like ice. "I will pay you back," she said fiercely, a sudden spark of intense determination cutting through her vulnerability. "I swear to you. What is your name?" "Arthur. Arthur Pendleton." "Arthur Pendleton," she repeated, committing it to memory. "I'm Beatrice. You have no idea what you've just done for me." "Just get safe, Beatrice," Arthur said, stepping back as the heavy hiss of the air brakes announced the arrival of the 41 bus. He watched her board, dropping the fare into the machine. She looked back at him through the rain-streaked window as the bus pulled away, her eyes locked onto his until the vehicle disappeared into the Seattle night. Arthur turned up his collar, stepped out of the shelter, and began the long, wet, 4-mile walk home. His stomach growled viciously, a hollow ache that he tried to ignore. He thought of Lily's smile. He had nothing left, but as the freezing rain soaked through his shoes, his conscience was warm. He had made the right choice. He had to believe that. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, mocking Arthur with its bright, unfeeling cheerfulness. He was exhausted. His legs ached from the brutal walk the night before, and his stomach was a tight, painful knot of pure hunger. He had fed Lily the absolute last of their groceries, a bowl of oatmeal and half an apple, before dropping her off at school. Now he stood in the suffocatingly beige lobby of Omnicorp Logistics. The atmosphere in the building was toxic. For weeks, rumors had been swirling that the company, which had been bleeding money for quarters, had been hostilely taken over by a massive tech and logistics conglomerate. Today was the day the new ownership was coming to assess the assets, corporate speak for gutting the staff and firing anyone they deemed redundant. Arthur swiped his badge at the turnstile. The digital clock on the wall read 8:04 a.m. "Pendleton!" Arthur winced. The shrill, nasal bark belonged to Gregory Finch, the regional floor manager. Finch was a petty tyrant of a man, built like a fire hydrant, who wore suits that were slightly too tight and entirely too cheap. He delighted in micromanagement and had a specific, lingering disdain for Arthur, viewing Arthur's need for strict hours to pick up his daughter as a lack of corporate dedication. Finch marched over, holding a tablet like a weapon. 8:04, Arthur. You're late. The bus system was backed up, Mr. Finch, Arthur lied smoothly, unable to admit he had walked 2 hours because he gave his bus fare to a stranger. I apologize. It won't impact my daily quota. Oh, it won't impact your quota because you won't have time to meet it, Finch sneered, a cruel glint in his eye. The new CEO of Sterling Innovations is arriving in 20 minutes for a full floor inspection. Word is, They're looking to cut 30% of the workforce today. And quite frankly, Pendleton, a man who can't even arrive on time, isn't exactly essential personnel. Arthur felt a cold spike of genuine terror hit his heart. Gregory, please. You know my metrics are the best on the floor. I process twice the data of anyone in my sector. I need this job. My daughter. Save the sob story for the unemployment line, Finch interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. I'm running point on the tour today. I've already drafted a list of recommended terminations to present to the new boss to show initiative. Your name is sitting pretty right at the top, Arthur. Go clean out your desk. Make it easy on yourself. Finch turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Arthur standing in the lobby, the blood roaring in his ears. No, it couldn't end like this. He pictured Lily's face, her asthma inhaler that was running perilously low, the rent notice tacked to his apartment door. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his throat. He walked mechanically to his cubicle, ignoring the terrified whispers of his co-workers. The entire floor was vibrating with anxiety. At exactly 8:30 a.m., the atmosphere shifted. It was palpable, like the air pressure dropping before a severe storm. The heavy double doors of the main processing floor swung open, and silence fell over the room of 200 employees, so quickly you could hear a pin drop. Through the doors walked a vanguard of security personnel in sharp black suits, followed by a handful of nervous-looking Omnicorp executives. But all eyes immediately went to the woman at the center of the formation. Arthur peeked over the top of his cubicle wall. The woman moved with the predatory grace of a shark gliding through open water. She was dressed in a bespoke, immaculate ivory pantsuit that probably cost more than Arthur made in 3 years. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon, and her posture radiated absolute, terrifying authority. She didn't just walk into the room. She owned it the second her designer heels clicked against the linoleum. This was the billionaire founder of Sterling Innovations. A woman known on the cover of Forbes as a ruthless visionary, a tech prodigy who built an empire from the ground up, famous for taking 0 prisoners and accepting 0 excuses. Arthur squinted, his breath catching in his throat. He ducked back down behind his monitor, his heart hammering wildly against his ribs. No, it's impossible. He risked another glance. The dark hair, the sharp, calculating intelligence in the eyes, the high cheekbones, the bruise. Faintly, underneath what must have been incredibly expensive makeup, a shadow of a bruise still lingered on her left cheekbone. It was Beatrice, the shivering, barefoot, desperate woman from the bus stop, the woman who had taken his last $5. Arthur's mind reeled, spinning out of control. Why was she at a bus stop? Why was she mugged? Did she know he worked here? No, she couldn't have. He hadn't told her his employer, only his name. It was a cosmic, almost cruel coincidence. And now, she was here to fire him. He shrank into his chair, trying to make himself as invisible as possible. If she saw him, what would she think? Would she be embarrassed that an employee had seen her in such a pathetic state? Would she fire him just to eliminate the witness to her vulnerability? Rich people were notoriously protective of their pride. Miss Sterling, Gregory Finch's voice echoed across the silent floor. He was practically vibrating with sycophantic joy, rushing forward to intercept her. Welcome to the Seattle branch. I am Gregory Finch, Regional Manager. It is an absolute honor. Beatrice Sterling stopped it. She didn't smile. She looked at Finch the way one might look at a smudge of dirt on a clean window. Mr. Finch, Beatrice said. Her voice was smooth, cultured, and carried effortlessly across the massive room. It was the same voice from the bus stop, but stripped of all fear. It was forged steel. "I understand you have prepared a briefing for me." "Yes, ma'am." "Right this way," Finch beamed, gesturing toward the central conference glass room that overlooked the floor. I took the liberty of evaluating the current staff. Omnicorp has been carrying a lot of dead weight. Miss Sterling, I have compiled a comprehensive list of immediate terminations to streamline your new acquisition. It will save the company $3 million in the first quarter alone. Beatrice's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. "You drafted a termination list before I even evaluated the branch's operations?" "I know how you operate, Miss Sterling. Efficiency above all," Finch said, puffing out his chest, completely missing the dangerous tone in her voice. "In fact, I've already instructed the worst offender to begin packing his desk. A data processor named Arthur Pendleton. Habitually late, insubordinate, completely lackadaisical." Arthur closed his eyes. It was over. The guillotine had fallen. Silence stretched across the room. It was thick, heavy, and absolute. "What did you say?" Beatrice's voice was suddenly quiet, too quiet. It sent a shiver down the spine of everyone within earshot. Finch faltered, his smile slipping slightly. I said he's habitually late." "Arthur Pendleton." Beatrice Sterling turned slowly. She ignored Finch completely and walked to the edge of the glass conference room, her piercing gaze sweeping over the sea of cubicles. "Arthur Pendleton," Beatrice called out, her voice ringing clear as a bell through the dead-silent office. "Are you here?" Arthur swallowed hard. His mouth was dry as dust. He knew he couldn't hide. Slowly, feeling the eyes of 200 co-workers burning into him, he stood up from behind his cubicle wall. He looked across the room. Across the distance, his tired, defeated eyes met the sharp, commanding gaze of the billionaire CEO. Beatrice stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. Her immaculate composure slipped, replaced by a look of profound, genuine shock. She stared at his worn trench coat draped over his chair. She stared at his face, recognizing the deep lines of exhaustion she had seen under the flickering light of the bus shelter just 12 hours prior. "Well, well," Beatrice whispered, though the acoustics of the room carried it to Arthur's ears. A slow, terrifying smile spread across her face. It wasn't a corporate smile. It was the smile of a predator that had just found exactly what it was looking for. She turned back to a pale, sweating Gregory Finch. "Mr. Finch," Beatrice said softly, "bring me his file, now." The glass-walled conference room felt less like an executive suite and more like an interrogation chamber. Gregory Finch practically tripped over his own feet as he scrambled to the filing cabinets outside, his face flushed a mottled, unhealthy crimson. He returned clutching a manila folder, his hands trembling so violently the paper audibly rattled. Beatrice Sterling snatched the file from his hands without a word. She didn't invite him to sit. She didn't sit herself. She simply stood at the head of the long mahogany table, her eyes scanning the documents with the terrifying speed of a machine processing code. Arthur watched from his cubicle, his stomach churning. 200 pairs of eyes darted between him and the glass room. He felt entirely exposed, a moth pinned to a corkboard. He thought of his daughter, Lily, and the mounting bills at Harborview Medical Center for her respiratory treatments. The crushing weight of failure threatened to suffocate him right there in his ergonomic chair. Inside the glass room, Beatrice flipped a page, then another. The silence dragged on for 3 excruciating minutes. Finally, she closed the file and tossed it onto the table. It landed with a heavy, definitive smack. "Mr. Finch," Beatrice said, her voice carrying through the open door of the conference room, clearly intended for the entire floor to hear. You informed me that Arthur Pendleton is habitual dead weight, a detriment to Omnicorp's efficiency. Yes, Miss Sterling, Finch stammered, sweating profusely now. He lacks the necessary drive. He strictly adheres to a 9-to-5 schedule, refusing mandatory unpaid overtime. He lacks corporate loyalty. I see, Beatrice murmured, pacing slowly around the table. I am looking at his performance metrics for the last 8 quarters. Are you aware, Mr. Finch, that Mr. Pendleton processes 38% more data volume than your second-best employee? Finch swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Well, raw data isn't everything, ma'am. There's team cohesion. I am also looking at his error rate, Beatrice interrupted, her tone dropping by 10 degrees. It is 0.02%. The floor average is 4%. He is doing the work of 3 junior analysts, flawlessly. And yet, you have denied him a cost-of-living raise for 3 consecutive years, citing budgetary constraints, while simultaneously awarding yourself a 15% performance bonus last November. A collective gasp echoed across the processing floor. Several employees physically recoiled. Finch looked as though the floor had suddenly dropped out from under him. Miss Sterling, I can explain the allocation of branch funds. You won't have to, Beatrice said softly. She stepped out of the conference room, walking directly onto the processing floor. The security detail shifted, maintaining a discreet but heavily armed perimeter. She stopped a few feet from Arthur's desk, but she kept her eyes locked on Finch. Last night, Beatrice began, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. I was scheduled to sign the final acquisition papers for Omnicorp at the Chase Bank Executive Tower downtown. My own uncle, Richard Sterling, who sits on my board of directors, orchestrated a hostile counterplay. He hired professionals to intercept my vehicle. They ran my driver off the road, dragged me from the car, and stripped me of my phone, my identification, and my access cards. Arthur stared at her, the pieces suddenly clicking into place, the missing shoes, the ruined suit, the bruise. The goal, Beatrice continued, her eyes flashing with a cold, furious fire, was to leave me stranded and untraceable in the freezing rain, just long enough to miss the midnight filing deadline, allowing his faction to trigger a breach of contract clause and seize control of my holding company. She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping over the terrified faces of the Omnicorp staff. I walked for miles. I was ignored by dozens of people, good, upstanding citizens who looked right through me because I appeared to be nothing more than a vagrant. I was freezing, injured, and entirely powerless. She finally let her eyes settle on Arthur. The predatory edge in her expression melted away, replaced by something profound and uncomfortably raw. Except for one man, she said quietly. A man who looked at a shivering stranger and handed over the absolute last $5 in his bank account so she could get on a bus to the central precinct. A man who sacrificed his own meals, his own bus fare, and walked 4 miles home in a torrential downpour because he refused to let another human being freeze to death on the pavement. The entire floor turned in unison to look at Arthur. He felt his face burn hot, his worn collar suddenly feeling very tight. Beatrice turned back to Finch, who was now shaking visibly, a sheen of terrified sweat coating his forehead. That $5 got me to the police station, Beatrice said, her voice hardening back into steel. It allowed me to contact my head of security, lock down my personal assets, dispatch a legal team to Chase Bank, and systematically crush my uncle's coup with 20 minutes to spare. That $5 saved a $4 billion empire. She stepped closer to Finch, leaning in slightly. And you, Mr. Finch, a man who steals from his own top performers to line his pockets, had the audacity to tell me that the man who saved my company is dead weight. Finch opened his mouth, but only a pathetic squeak emerged. "You are terminated, Gregory," Beatrice said, the words falling like the blade of a guillotine. "Effective immediately. Security will escort you off the premises. You will leave your company phone, your keys, and your dignity on that table. If you attempt to contact anyone at Omnicorp or Sterling Innovations, my legal team will bury you so deep in litigation your grandchildren will be paying off the court fees." Two men in sharp black suits materialized behind Finch. "Sir, right this way," one of them said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. The floor remained dead silent as Finch, stripped of all his petty tyrannical power, was marched toward the elevators. The heavy doors slid shut, sealing his fate. Beatrice let out a long, measured breath, smoothing the front of her immaculate ivory jacket. She turned back to Arthur, the terrifying CEO persona receding just a fraction. "Mr. Pendleton," she said, gesturing toward the glass office, "would you join me, please? We have a great deal to discuss." Arthur walked into the conference room, feeling like he was walking on the moon. The gravity was all wrong. Reality had fractured and reassembled itself into something utterly unrecognizable. Beatrice closed the glass door behind him, instantly cutting off the ambient hum of the processing floor. She clicked a button on a remote, and the transparent glass frosted over, rendering them completely invisible to the 200 staring employees outside. She turned to him, and for the first time since she walked through the double doors, she genuinely smiled. It transformed her face, making her look younger, warmer, and remarkably like the woman he had spoken to at the bus shelter. "Please sit," she said, gesturing to a plush leather chair. Arthur sat down stiffly, his hands resting awkwardly on his knees. "Miss Sterling, I don't know what to say. I didn't know who you were." "I know," Beatrice said, taking the seat across from him. "That is precisely why it mattered. If you had known I was Beatrice Sterling, it would have been an investment. Because you thought I was a nobody, it was an act of grace. I don't encounter much grace in my line of work, Arthur." She slid his personnel file across the polished wood table toward him. "I spent the last 10 minutes reading your history," she said, leaning forward, resting her elbows on the table. "Not just the metrics. The background check my team ran on the drive over. I know about your wife, Sarah. I am deeply sorry for your loss. I also know about the medical debt, the foreclosure on your house in Bellevue, and the fact that you are raising a 7-year-old girl named Lily who requires a highly specific, very expensive pediatric pulmonologist at Harborview." Arthur felt a sudden, sharp spike of defensiveness. "My private life is entirely your own," Beatrice agreed smoothly, holding up a hand. "But I am a businesswoman, Arthur. I evaluate assets. I recognize talent, and I fix broken systems. Gregory Finch was a broken system. You, on the other hand, are a profoundly undervalued asset." She tapped a manicured fingernail against the file. "Your data optimization models are brilliant. You've been creating workarounds for Omnicorp's outdated software that have saved this branch hundreds of thousands of hours, and Finch has been taking the credit. It was just streamlining," Arthur muttered, looking down at his taped-up shoes, feeling entirely out of his depth. "It was engineering," Beatrice corrected him. "Arthur, when I promised you at that bus stop that I would pay you back, I meant it. But handing you a large sum of cash feels insulting to both your intellect and your dignity." She opened a sleek leather portfolio and withdrew a heavy, cream-colored document. She slid it across the table. "Sterling Innovations does not need a data entry clerk in Seattle," Beatrice stated. "We need a director of regional logistics, someone with the ground-level understanding of the systems, the intellect to optimize them, and the integrity to lead a team without exploiting them. That position comes with a base salary of $250,000 a year, comprehensive stock options, and a platinum-tier corporate healthcare plan that will cover 100% of Lily's treatments at Harborview, retroactive to the beginning of this fiscal year. Arthur stopped breathing. He stared at the contract. The numbers blurred together. 250,000. Platinum healthcare. Lily. His chest hitched. A sudden, violent wave of emotion slammed into him. 3 years of suffocating terror, of counting pennies at the grocery store, of watching his daughter struggle to breathe while he prayed his credit card wouldn't be declined. It all rushed to the surface, breaking against the dam of his composure. He put a trembling hand over his mouth, closing his eyes tightly as a single, hot tear escaped and tracked down his face. Beatrice didn't say anything. She didn't offer a platitude. She simply sat there, allowing him the space to process the tectonic shift in his universe. You don't owe me this," Arthur choked out, his voice thick with unshed tears. "It was only $5. "Arthur," Beatrice said softly, her piercing eyes locking onto his. "To you it was only $5. To me, it was everything. You gave me your last lifeline when you were drowning yourself. In the corporate world, we call that a high-risk venture. It's only fair that you reap the dividends." She held out a silver fountain pen. "Now," the billionaire CEO said, her smile returning, sharp and bright. "Are you going to sign this contract, Director Pendleton? Or do I need to find another bus stop to recruit from?" Arthur looked at the pen, then at the woman who had returned from the rain to change his life. He picked up the pen, his hand finally steady, and signed his name. The crushing weight he had carried for 3 long years finally lifted, evaporating into the quiet air of the glass room. True wealth is rarely measured in bank accounts, but in the currency of human empathy. Arthur Pendleton gave his last $5, not knowing it was the seed of his own salvation. Beatrice Sterling proved that while corporate empires are built on ruthless efficiency, they are sustained by loyalty. Sometimes, the most lucrative investment a person can make is simply choosing not to look away from a stranger's pain.